Empress Meishō was born in 1624 as the daughter of Emperor Go-Mizunoo and Tokugawa Masako. From the moment of her birth, she existed at the intersection of two powers, the ceremonial court in Kyoto and the military regime rising in Edo. Her father carried the symbolic authority of the imperial line, while her mother descended from the house that held the country's actual power, the Tokugawa shogunate. Masako's father, Tokugawa Hidetada, was the second shogun of the dynasty that had, by this time, turned the emperor into a figure of ritual rather than policy. Meishō was not merely a child of nobility. She was a vessel in a quiet arrangement designed to stitch two unstable institutions together, an heir who belonged to both the blood of divine lineage and the will of a military regime that required symbolic legitimacy. Her father, Go-Mizunoo, had come to the throne in a Japan reshaped by civil war and now held together by cautious military order. But even within the tightly managed imperial court, conflict remained. In 1629, a ceremonial dispute over an imperial visit to Nijo Castle, one of the Tokugawa residences in Kyoto, triggered scandal. The emperor had appointed several court ladies to positions of rank, a seemingly innocuous act that was interpreted by the Tokugawa as a challenge to protocol. When some of these women violated the strictures around access and behavior expected by the shogunate, the bakufu's response was severe. The court saw it as interference. The Tokugawa saw it as enforcement. Caught in the middle, Emperor Go-Mizunoo chose to abdicate. But rather than hand power to a brother or cousin, he placed his 6-year-old daughter on the throne. It was not an abdication out of resignation, but a calculated retreat. By installing Meishō, he could maintain influence without the weight of formal office. A woman on the throne, especially one so young, posed no threat to the balance between Kyoto and Edo. Meishō's early reign was shaped not by her own will, but by the movements of those around her. Her father remained in the palace complex, exerting his authority as a cloistered emperor. The Insei system, where retired emperors governed behind the scenes, had long served as a mechanism for controlling succession, and Go-Mizunoo revived it with precision. In parallel, her mother Masako maintained constant correspondence with Edo and managed court appointments with care, often working through her connections to ensure that Tokugawa influence remained visible in Kyoto's ceremonies. The presence of a reigning empress created a symbolic opportunity, but one bound in layers of expectation and restriction. The court treated her as a sacred presence, but not a political actor. The shogunate honored her with tribute and ritual, but ensured that policy remained outside her reach. Within the palace walls, Meishō grew into adolescence, surrounded by custom, pageantry, and tightly scripted ritual. She attended seasonal festivals, received emissaries, and participated in imperial poetry contests, all under the close supervision of senior courtiers and her parents. She signed edicts written by others, recited prayers selected for her, and presided over ceremonies that maintained the imperial tradition, but avoided any question of policy. Every movement reinforced a core truth. She was the throne's occupant, not its owner. Her education emphasized etiquette and classical literature, not legal administration or governance. There was no suggestion she would reign indefinitely. Her time on the throne was always meant to be temporary, a pause between male rulers and a buffer between imperial autonomy and Tokugawa oversight. Yet her reign, though circumscribed, marked an unusual moment in imperial history. Few women had ruled in their own right, and fewer still under such visible political pressure. While Japan did not forbid female succession outright at the time, it was not encouraged. Meishō's accession was the product of necessity, not a shift in ideology. The court did not restructure itself to accommodate her rule. Rather, it adjusted to minimize her impact. Even as she matured, her role remained static. The cloistered emperor still issued decisions, the shogunate still maintained its grip over national affairs, and the court continued to rotate through officials who answered to both Kyoto and Edo. Meishō reigned, but she did not govern. Her presence offered stability, but not continuity. The years that followed would see her name inscribed on official records, her image used in imperial rituals, and her signature affixed to documents she did not draft. But beneath the smooth operation of court life, tensions remained unresolved. The Tokugawa had not yet determined the limits of their partnership with the imperial institution, and the court itself had not decided whether it would remain passive or attempt to reclaim influence. In this delicate space, Meishō stood at the center, not as a ruler making choices, but as a symbol placed where two systems met. Her reign was both a solution and a placeholder. A reign meant to preserve appearances, while the real contests happened behind walls she did not control. Emperor Go-Mizunoo did not vanish when he gave up the throne. In 1629, amid scandal and political pressure, he stepped aside in name only. His abdication was not a retreat, but a reconfiguration. The court in Kyoto called it an act of discretion, an attempt to protect the dignity of the imperial house after the so-called Purple Robe incident, when the Tokugawa shogunate intervened to invalidate several imperial honors. The deeper cause, however, lay in a quiet contest between two centers of authority. The emperor had granted ceremonial garments to Buddhist priests without Tokugawa approval, challenging the bakufu's grip on religious influence. It was not the garments themselves, but the assertion of autonomy that unsettled Edo. When the shogunate responded with swift disapproval, tensions flared. The court, still largely ceremonial, could not afford open defiance. Rather than escalate, Go-Mizunoo abdicated. But he did not disappear. He became a cloistered emperor, an insane ruler, resuming an older model of backstage control while placing a child on the throne to buy time and avoid confrontation. Meishō was 6. She did not speak policy. She did not wield power. But she gave the court something it needed: a body on the throne, a symbol. The daughter of a Tokugawa mother and an emperor who refused to be sidelined. Go-Mizunoo continued to reside within the palace compound, issuing decisions through intermediaries, drafting ceremonial texts, and meeting with trusted courtiers in private. He still had the knowledge, the memory of ritual precedent, and the loyalty of those who had served him. With no adult male heir of sufficient age to take the throne, and no appetite for further conflict with the shogunate, installing Meishō allowed him to project a gesture of humility while tightening his control. Her reign became a vessel for his decisions. Her voice, when it was heard, was shaped in advance. The institution of cloistered rule was not new in Japan. From the Heian period onward, emperors had used abdication to maintain influence without formal accountability. But in the Tokugawa era, with real political power residing in Edo, this system took on new implications. By removing himself from the visible chain of command, Go-Mizunoo avoided direct confrontation with the shogunate while continuing to guide court appointments, ritual precedents, and succession planning. It was a strategy of invisibility, maintaining dignity, resisting external pressure, and reshaping the court from within. But for Meishō, it meant growing into a role that was occupied in spirit before she could ever claim it for herself. Within the palace, the language of authority remained unchanged. Edicts bore Meishō's seal. Celebrations marked anniversaries of her enthronement. But all major decisions passed through her father's network. Counselors consulted him directly. Ritual texts were revised under his supervision. Even the poems submitted to the court competitions bore his stylistic preferences. Her ceremonial presence remained vital, but the reins of influence never reached her hands. Her agency, such as it was, became secondary to preserving a front, an image of imperial continuity unmarred by visible dissent. She was asked to maintain stability, but not to define it. This arrangement suited both Kyoto and Edo. The court preserved its hierarchy, the shogunate avoided disruption, and Go-Mizunoo continued to exercise cultural and administrative control without triggering a constitutional rupture. Meishō, meanwhile, remained at the center of a carefully managed stage. Her movement was controlled, her education supervised, her access to key figures filtered through layers of formality. She was not ignored, she was curated, honored, but not autonomous. The court revered her lineage and the precedent she embodied, but it did not prepare her for governance. Her role was visual, her silence functional. The pageantry of her reign served to obscure its limitations. Behind the titles and tributes, Go-Mizunoo's continued influence shaped more than ceremony. He influenced religious policy, directed court spending, and oversaw preparations for his eventual male successor. His choices, though discreet, set the course of Meishō's reign and ensured that the imperial court remained aligned with his vision. His decision to step back allowed him to shape the future while shielding himself from direct interference. But it also defined the boundaries of his daughter's rule before she had the chance to test them. She sat the throne, but he held its weight. The man who stepped backwards never truly left. And as his presence lingered, so too did the limits placed around her. Tokugawa Masako entered the imperial court not as a political hostage, but as a carefully placed force. The daughter of Tokugawa Hidetada, the second shogun, and sister to Tokugawa Iemitsu, the reigning shogun during her daughter's rule. She carried the weight of the new Japan, the one ruled not by ancient ritual, but by military command and centralized power. When she married Emperor Go-Mizunoo in 1620, the union was more than ceremonial. It was a statement that Tokugawa could now claim a role not just in governance, but in lineage. Through Masako, the shogunate placed its blood directly into the imperial line, weaving itself into the fabric of divine succession. Her presence in Kyoto, far from her family's base in Edo, marked a quiet form of surveillance and influence embedded within the very heart of court tradition. Masako held no official title of empress, but she operated with a clarity of purpose that surpassed most women and many men at court. Her status as a Tokugawa daughter gave her access that others could not match. She was both participant and observer, slipping between ceremonial roles and private negotiations. When Meishō took the throne at the age of 6, it was Masako who guarded the boundary between maternal protection and political management. She acted as an intermediary between the cloistered emperor and the Tokugawa court, ensuring that each side remained informed and appeased. She navigated the court's rigid ranks with care, surrounding Meishō with attendants who reported first to her and shielding her daughter from the more predatory ambitions of older courtiers. Inside the palace, Masako used the tools available to her: patronage, alliances, and an unwavering memory of her family's interests. She funded temple restorations, sponsored poetry contests, and maintained a steady stream of gifts to court officials whose loyalty could shift with the season. While Edo kept its distance in official records, Masako ensured that nothing moved in Kyoto without Tokugawa awareness. Her influence was quiet but decisive. She neither challenged the emperor directly nor imposed herself in council meetings. She worked behind walls and through letters. Her voice did not echo through court debates, but her presence shaped their outcomes. At the same time, she shielded Meishō from the court's less visible dangers, its rivalries, betrayals, and ambitions for influence through proximity. The emperor's palace was filled with families who had for generations lived off imperial association. To them, the reign of a child empress offered opportunity. Masako understood the risks of indulgence, isolation, and symbolic overreach. She trained Meishō in court conduct, controlled the pace of her exposure to politics, and restricted who had direct access to her. In doing so, she preserved her daughter's ceremonial integrity while narrowing her path to independence. Protection and control became indistinguishable. Masako's role also served a broader purpose: the stabilization of relations between the imperial court and the Tokugawa Bakufu. The court was ancient but weakened, and the shogunate was powerful but new. Masako embodied their merger. Her position as a mother of the sovereign allowed the shogunate to claim deference to tradition while securing its dominance. She reassured Kyoto that the Tokugawa were protectors, not usurpers. Her success lay in subtlety. She never threatened the emperor's symbolic rule, but she made it clear that no decision would pass unexamined. The court learned to live with her influence because it could not afford open rejection of the Tokugawa line now flowing through its future. Yet her care came with cost. Meishō grew up surrounded by control disguised as comfort. Her mother's presence was constant, her gestures always measured. The palace around her responded more to Masako's shadow than to her own authority. Every servant, every tutor, every ceremonial request passed through filters Masako had set. There was no path to ruling on her own terms, only the terms preserved for her by a mother bound to both blood and allegiance. The Tokugawa name, meant to secure her place, also became a weight that shaped her silence. Masako ensured that no one harmed her daughter, but she also ensured that no one empowered her. Meishō remained sovereign by ritual, but never by right, and behind her throne, always a step removed, stood the woman who had made that balance possible and permanent. The court that surrounded Empress Meishō was a world of practiced restraint and deliberate tradition, shaped by centuries of inherited precedent and quiet maneuvering. Its ministers, though deferential in posture, operated with the confidence of those who had long claimed influence without spectacle. They belonged to noble families that had survived regime changes by adapting their language, not their loyalties. By the time Meishō sat the throne, Many of these men had grown accustomed to shaping policy through ritualized discretion. The presence of a child empress did not alarm them. It relieved them. But as she grew older, the question of her voice, whether it might one day try to rule, remained unspoken and ever present. They did not fear what she said. They feared the possibility that she might begin to say it with intent. The minister's strategy was not confrontation, but insulation. They placed Meishō in a structure too vast for agency and too reverent for questioning. Her days were organized around rites, seasonal festivals, ancestral offerings, poetic commemorations, and public appearances that demanded grace but not thought. Behind each ceremonial act stood a team of senior counselors and chamberlains who drafted the texts, arranged the symbols, and controlled the rhythm of her presence. What decisions existed at court were filtered through layers of precedence and consultation. By the time they reached her, they no longer needed approval, only a signature. These ministers did not deny her intelligence. They denied her entry into the sphere where power moved freely. Among them were men who served her father still, directly or in spirit, those who remembered the tension of the previous reign and wished only to avoid repeating it. The memory of conflict with the Tokugawa remained fresh. These ministers saw in Meishō both an obligation and a risk. Her bloodline connected her to the shogunate through her mother and to divine legitimacy through her father. Any assertion of independent authority could be read as alignment with one side over the other. Silence was safer, passivity more stable. The court structure became a shield, not just for the state, but for themselves. If she remained ceremonial, they remained indispensable. Retired emperors, too, played a part. Go-Mizunoo's continued presence within the palace compound ensured that Meishō's reign followed his design. His influence shaped the appointments of key advisors, the content of imperial correspondence, and the tone of her public image. Even those who did not report directly to him worked under the weight of his example. A woman on the throne could be accepted, even celebrated, as long as she did not rule in full. Any sign that she might outgrow her role as figurehead risked destabilizing a balance that had taken years to construct. Bureaucrats and court scholars reinforced this containment through education. Meishō was taught poetry, history, etiquette, and classical Chinese, the tools of noble refinement. But she was not trained in administrative law, financial policy, or land management. These subjects were kept within the male bureaucratic ranks, passed through formal schools inaccessible to imperial women. Her lessons were a mirror, reflecting what the court expected her to embody, not what it feared she might challenge. Even when she presided over councils, her role was symbolic. The minutes were recorded before the meetings began. Her presence served legitimacy, not leadership. The deeper irony lay in what her silence represented. As long as she remained quiet, her reign could be interpreted by others, used to claim continuity, stability, and obedience to divine order. But if she had spoken, clearly, consistently, and without script, those same interpreters would have found themselves exposed. Her silence allowed them to remain in control. Her voice, even if tempered and reasoned, would have forced them to confront the limits of their own legitimacy. They bowed before her because it preserved the illusion of hierarchy, but they ruled around her because that illusion had to remain undisturbed. In this world of lacquered ritual and political shadows, Meishō's image was polished and her will diluted. The ministers who bowed before her did so not out of devotion, but necessity. They knew the structure could not withstand a sovereign who chose to move beyond the ornamental. So they preserved her stillness, ensured her reverence, and protected her from the one danger they could not control, herself. Prince Tsukuhito was born in 1633, 4 years after his sister Meishō had already taken the throne. He was the son of Emperor Go-Mizunoo and one of his court ladies, not Tokugawa Masako, but another consort of lesser political weight. From the start, his existence was watched carefully, not because he was a threat, but because he represented a solution. Meishō's reign, though stable, had never been expected to last indefinitely. She was not installed to begin a dynasty, but to maintain a pause. With no male heirs of age in 1629, her succession had served the moment. But once Tsukuhito reached adolescence, the court quietly resumed the machinery of preparation, not overtly, not through proclamations, through curriculum, tutors, and the gradual reorientation of attention away from Meishō's rituals and toward the court's future. Tsukuhito was trained within the palace, under the watchful direction of Go-Mizunoo and a trusted circle of scholars. Unlike some imperial sons who were steered toward Buddhist monasteries or distant provincial appointments, he was kept close. His education focused on classical law, history, and court administration. He was taught to read the precedents of succession and to understand the language of edicts. While Meishō continued to preside over ceremonies with grace and precision, her brother was being taught the structures beneath them. There were no formal declarations of intention, but courtiers, ministers, and scribes adjusted their behavior. Invitations shifted, audiences shortened. The reverence remained, but the reach of her influence narrowed. The center of planning had already begun to move. As Meishō entered her 20s, her presence at court remained dignified but increasingly isolated. She had no husband, no consort, no child. That was by design. Marriage for a reigning empress introduced risk, claims of shared power, disputes over succession, and the possibility of offspring who might complicate the court's chosen path. The Tokugawa had no interest in seeing Meishō's line extended independently. Her unmarried status preserved her ceremonial value, while reinforcing the argument that her reign should not continue beyond necessity. Within the palace walls, she lived with honor, but apart. Even routine matters required approval from intermediaries who reported elsewhere. Her schedule was filled with carefully controlled duties. Her voice remained formal, her signature restricted to texts written by others. The talk of abdication was never spoken in her presence as command. It came through ritual, through the quiet withdrawal of responsibilities, through the arrival of new faces at council meetings she once presided over. The court had done this before, transitioning emperors, not through force, but by shifting the architecture of relevance. When the time came, it would not be framed as dismissal. It would be described as duty, as precedent, as natural order. And still, beneath the language of grace, it remained betrayal. Meishō had ruled without scandal, without war, without defiance. Yet her departure was prepared as if it were necessary for survival. The decision to elevate Tsukuhito was formalized in 1643. He was 15. The court announced Meishō's abdication as a peaceful transition, the return to male succession, the continuation of order. She stepped down without objection, because objection had no place in the system that defined her reign. Her brother ascended the throne as Emperor Go-Mizunoo. The court praised his youth, his intellect, his promise. Meishō was honored as a retired empress, her name still spoken with respect, her position secured by etiquette. But her authority gone. For Go-Mizunoo, the path had been cleared long before the ceremony. His sister's reign, though framed as a success of stability, had been constructed to end. She had reigned so he could rule, and those who had trained her to embody silence ensured that she would leave without disruption. The transition came not with resistance, but with the quiet acceptance of what had always been arranged. In the end, it was not her decisions that shaped the court's future, but the decisions made for her. Her brother's rise was her final duty, and the throne she had held became the one she was never meant to keep. In 1643, without public protest or clear necessity, Empress Meishō abdicated the Chrysanthemum Throne. She was 19 years old. The official language described her departure as voluntary, an act of wisdom, deference, and traditional order. But there was no visible cause. She was not unwell. She had not failed. Her reign had brought neither crisis nor instability. Yet the court moved forward with succession plans, as if the outcome had long been agreed. The machinery of imperial transition, built for ceremony and concealment, functioned precisely as intended. The process unfolded behind closed screens, with the language of reverence, masking the reality that the decision had never truly been hers. The abdication was announced as a peaceful return to precedent. Her half-brother, Prince Tsuguhito, was named Emperor Go-Mizunoo. The timing was deliberate. He had reached the age of 15, considered adequate for ceremonial leadership, and his education, directed quietly by their father, Go-Mizunoo, had prepared him for the role. His claim was not contested. The ministers, scholars, and court elders offered their congratulations, submitted their verses, and reaffirmed their loyalty to the new emperor. For Meishō, the moment was stripped of personal intention. The proclamation released in her name spoke of harmony, the burden of office, and the natural progression of lineage. But it bore the imprint of those who had crafted it on her behalf. The orchestration of the abdication rested with those who had defined her reign from the beginning. Emperor Go-Mizunoo, still active in court life as a cloistered sovereign, ensured that the transfer unfolded without rupture. Tokugawa Masako, Meishō's mother, remained influential in court appointments and communications with Edo. Ministers aligned with the Fujiwara and other noble families echoed support. The Tokugawa Bakufu, while not directly intervening, received reports and gave quiet approval. No single institution pushed the abdication forward, but none questioned it either. It was not imposed by force, but by momentum. A structure had been built around Meishō that led only to one conclusion: she was to preserve the throne until a suitable male heir stood ready to resume it. When that time came, the language of duty provided the final push. There was no farewell procession, no moment of visible grief. The transfer was managed with efficiency and formality. In the records, it was recorded as a moment of dignity. Yet behind the polished surface was the echo of a larger pattern, one that stretched back centuries. Women had been elevated to the throne before, often in times of uncertainty or interruption. And once that uncertainty passed, they were asked to step aside quietly and without disruption. Their reigns were praised for stability, then written off as temporary. The role of a female emperor had never been defined as lasting. It was a tool used in moments of difficulty, then retired when no longer required. Meishō was not the first to live through this pattern, and she would not be the last. She did not leave the palace. Like many retired emperors, she remained within the imperial complex, now bearing the title of Daijo Tenno. Her daily life changed little. She still received visits, attended ceremonies, and observed the rituals of court life. But she no longer presided. Her seal was removed from state documents. Her presence shifted from sovereign to witness. Her authority had always been curated. Now it was concluded. Those who had once bowed before her now bowed before her brother. The continuity of imperial tradition had been preserved, but not through her will. Meishō's abdication marked the closing of a chapter written by others. The language used to describe it ensured that her silence would be read as serenity, not submission. But the underlying structure remained unchanged. A woman had been placed on the throne to absorb tension. Once peace returned, her role was no longer needed. Her obedience, once praised as steadiness, became the reason she was dismissed. And the system that placed her there, sheltered her, and removed her, moved on without pause. After Empress Meishō stepped down in 1643, the court did not close its doors to her, but it did close the channels through which power flowed. She remained within the imperial palace, not in exile, but in carefully structured retirement. Her title changed to Daijo Tenno, or retired sovereign, a term used to signal honor without authority. The role came with courtesies, housing, attendance, and access to court rituals, but not decisions. In Kyoto, where tradition held memory tightly, she was treated with reverence. But that reverence no longer required her voice. She became a quiet presence in the background of events she once led, a living symbol of imperial continuity, who had been allowed to remain only because she no longer posed a question. The court was not unkind to her. There was no cruelty in her treatment, but the space she occupied was defined by limits. Her residence within the palace complex remained intact, furnished with lacquered screens, calligraphy scrolls, and ceremonial garments she no longer wore. Attendants served her with practiced formality, reciting the protocols of old. Visitors arrived according to schedule. The gifts they brought were symbolic: seasonal fabrics, court poetry, incense. Everything around her was preserved, but preservation, in the context of Meishō's world, also meant containment. Her surroundings became a carefully tended archive, not a sphere of influence. The rooms she lived in echoed with rites she once commanded. Now she observed them at a distance, her presence acknowledged, but no longer central. Kyoto, meanwhile, continued its rhythms. The court adapted to Emperor Go-Komyo's reign. New ministers rose, old councillors faded. The relationship with Edo deepened, formalized through carefully calibrated communication between the shogunate and the imperial household. Meishō watched these changes unfold, not as participant, but as a reminder of what had come before. She was a woman with the authority of memory, not the authority of command. That distinction allowed the court to honor her without reactivating her influence. She was consulted in ritual matters, her name invoked in poetic dedications, her presence required at seasonal events. But she did not decide. The rituals continued, and the silence around her deepened. Her daily life was structured by routine: morning prayers, private reading, visits from court ladies, occasional correspondence with distant relatives. The palace was her boundary, and it remained carefully guarded, not to protect her from harm, but to protect the system from her potential. Surveillance did not come through spies or soldiers. It came through ritual, protocol, and the quiet presence of attendants, whose first loyalty lay with the court, not with her. Every action she took was recorded. Every request she made passed through channels. This was the language of care, but it also served as control. Her autonomy was softened, not removed. That softening over years turned into invisibility. The city around her changed more than she did. Kyoto remained the spiritual center of the nation, but real power had shifted east. Edo expanded under the Tokugawa regime, becoming the administrative core of the country. Roads improved, trade networks widened. The imperial court, once the seat of authority, became increasingly symbolic. And Meishō, who had lived through the early consolidation of that change, remained within the old capital, unmoved, quiet, and ceremonially intact. Her life mirrored the court itself, preserved in form, diminished in function. Over time, the world outside her walls grew unfamiliar. New generations of nobles were born who had never known her as sovereign. Poets referenced her in past tense. Ministers recalled her reign as a moment of calm before transition. She was remembered, but not revisited. Her legacy was not debated. It was filed, neither contested nor celebrated. The palace kept her alive as a symbol, precisely because it no longer needed her as a ruler. And so she lived, year after year, in the rooms that once defined her reign, not forgotten, but held still. Empress Meishō's reign ended without disorder, but its place in imperial history was quickly narrowed to a function. She was the sovereign who held the throne until a male successor could assume it. From the moment her brother became Emperor Go-Komyo, her own reign was repositioned by the court, not as a period of rule to be examined, but as a necessary interruption, a ceremonial bridge in a line that was expected to remain male. The reasons for her accession were never fully addressed in official chronicles. The complications surrounding Go-Mizunoo's abdication, the political calculus of the Tokugawa alliance, and the absence of a ready male heir were folded into a broader narrative that emphasized continuity rather than cause. Her time on the throne became a convenient explanation for why the system had remained intact, not a chapter to be emulated. The court's treatment of her reign was shaped by long-standing ambivalence toward female rulership. While Japan had seen empresses before, Suiko, Kogyoku, Jito, and others, their reigns had generally occurred during moments of transition, and always with the expectation that a male would follow. None had established dynasties. None had reshaped the institution in ways that endured beyond their time. And although the law did not explicitly ban female succession, the precedent had grown more rigid over the centuries. By the Tokugawa period, the court's preference for male emperors had become cultural orthodoxy. In this context, Meishō's reign could be acknowledged only by narrowing its meaning. It was legitimate but temporary, sacred but suspended in time. Official records preserved the outline of her reign, ceremonies attended, edicts signed, festivals observed. But they offered little analysis and even less praise. Historians within the court and the scholars who followed them in later generations, rarely examined her political environment. They did not explore how her presence allowed Go-Mizunoo to retain influence, or how her maternal Tokugawa link stabilized relations with Edo. Instead, they emphasized the smoothness of her departure and the appropriateness of her obedience. The language used to describe her emphasized grace, purity, and composure, qualities consistent with ritual femininity, but distant from political leadership. Her silence, maintained under pressure and expectation, was reinterpreted as a natural trait rather than a cultivated constraint. Outside Kyoto, the story was even quieter. The Tokugawa Bakufu made no effort to publicize her reign beyond what protocol required. She had served her role, but she had not advanced their authority in a way that required celebration. For the regime in Edo, her tenure was part of the machinery of order, not a political shift. In the centuries that followed, as the Meiji Restoration restructured the Japanese state and redefined the emperor's role as head of a modern nation, female succession was explicitly prohibited. The 1889 Meiji Constitution enshrined male-only inheritance of the throne. In that context, Meishō's reign, though once legal and honored, was no longer considered a viable precedent. She was the last woman to rule Japan in her own right. Those who came later would serve as regents, consorts, or ceremonial placeholders, but not as sovereigns in name and law. Meishō's story became a footnote in imperial histories, mentioned less for what she did than for what she represented. She was recalled not as a ruler who shaped policy or forged alliances, but as evidence of how flexible the court could be in moments of necessity. Her reign offered proof that the throne could survive a deviation from its norms, but only temporarily. The court used her example to justify its return to male succession. Her presence, once required to hold the center, was used afterward to reinforce its boundaries. The silence that defined her reign extended beyond her lifetime, folded into a larger narrative that measured legitimacy by continuity, not by character. Meishō had not failed, she had not resisted, and so she was remembered with honor, but not with depth. Her reign was not erased. It was preserved in place, unexamined, as if to ensure no one would ask what might have happened if she had been allowed to do more. Empress Meishō died in 1696 at the age of 72. She had lived more than 5 decades beyond her abdication, watching the court change around her while remaining fixed in its periphery. Her death came quietly. There was no unrest, no mourning that spilled beyond the prescribed rites. Within the imperial court, the response was ceremonial and complete. The appropriate rituals were held, condolences delivered, and her remains interred with the dignity accorded to a former sovereign. The court recited the language of reverence. Priests conducted the funerary services. Attendants laid her legacy to rest in the official records. But beneath the ritual lay a deeper truth. Her passing had no political consequence. It disturbed no succession, inspired no reflection, and called forth no revision of the story that had already been written about her. The funeral was conducted with full imperial decorum. Her body was prepared according to court practice, her memory enshrined in the official mortuary texts. The court treated her death as it were the death of any sovereign, solemnly, but without deviation. There were no special edicts issued in her honor. No debates reawakened about her reign. The state moved on, because it had never paused for her. She had lived so long in retirement that many who served in court by the time of her death had known her only as a distant presence, an elder figure from a former time, preserved in rank but distant from policy. The outpouring of grief was measured, appropriate, and almost entirely performative. Outside the palace, her name evoked little. The world beyond Kyoto had changed. The Tokugawa shogunate had stabilized its authority. Edo had become the administrative center of the nation. The imperial institution, while still revered, no longer shaped national policy. Meishō's death did not touch the shogunate's structure or influence its course. There was no political use for her memory. Her story, already framed as a ceremonial bridge in imperial history, was complete. She had been valuable in her silence, not her voice, and her silence had not broken in life. In death, it became final. The historical records noted her passing without urgency. The veritable records of the emperor preserved her reign's chronology, the names of her retainers, and the rituals she had observed. But they did not elaborate. They did not speculate. There was no effort to reinterpret her rule or elevate her example. Her memory was confined to the margins of state history, acknowledged but rarely invoked. Even within the imperial family, her name faded from regular usage. Later generations would know of her only as a name on a list, not a force within the court's past. Over time, the quiet that had surrounded her reign hardened into neglect. The few scholars who examined her life did so with formality, repeating the language of stability, grace, and withdrawal. There was no reappraisal, no attempt to understand the constraints she endured or the roles she had served behind the pageantry. Her presence in the imperial lineage remained intact, but emotionally distant. The court did not discredit her. It simply forgot to remember her. Her death marked the end of a reign that had already been erased from public relevance before it ended. She had governed in name, retreated without resistance, and lingered in a palace that held her as symbol, not participant. When she died, the system that shaped her did not shift. It absorbed her passing with practiced stillness. The silence that had followed her since childhood did not lift. It settled over her completely. Empress Meishō's reign has long been remembered for its stillness. But stillness is not peace. It is not consent. It is not freedom. Her reign, which lasted 15 years, was not marked by crisis, but by constraint. From the moment she took the throne as a child, her role had been carefully constructed to preserve stability, to protect the court from scandal, and to maintain the illusion of continuity in a time of pressure. She ruled in name, not in direction. Her silence, often mistaken for serenity, was in fact a condition of survival. She had been placed on the throne because no suitable male heir was available, and because her presence provided a dignified solution to the tensions left behind by her father, Emperor Go-Mizunoo. His abdication in 1629, framed as an act of propriety, had come after a clash with the Tokugawa shogunate. Rather than fight or concede, he installed his young daughter as empress and continued to govern from behind a screen of ritual. The arrangement protected him, stabilized the court, and pleased the shogunate, which preferred a quiet sovereign in Kyoto while it consolidated power in Edo. Meishō became the sovereign nobody feared because they had designed her not to be feared. The ministers of the court ensured that the reins of governance never reached her hands. Her schedule was filled with rituals. Her name adorned documents, but her voice was never political. The court praised her discipline, her obedience, her ceremonial grace, but they never imagined her as a ruler with agency. When her younger half-brother, Prince Tsukuhito, came of age, the path was already cleared. The court declared the transition natural. She abdicated without contest. The system that placed her on the throne had always intended to remove her, gently and completely. She remained in the palace for the rest of her life, honored, attended, and still watched. Her daily routines continued, quiet, ritualized, and fixed in place. Over time, her name faded from regular memory. The court no longer looked to her for guidance. The shogunate had no reason to reference her rule. Later, historians spoke of her as a pause between male emperors, not as a figure with significance in her own right. Her reign became an example not of leadership, but of containment. The throne had been hers, but only so no one else would take it in a moment of instability. And yet, she endured. She reigned longer than her successor. She outlived the court officials who had written her out of power. She lived through decades of transformation in Kyoto and watched the imperial court become increasingly ornamental under the Tokugawa regime. Her silence, once used to define her, became a permanent fixture of her legacy. Not because she failed to speak, but because she was never allowed the space in which to speak freely. Her reign reveals the logic of power built on appearances. It shows how an entire system can function around someone while never allowing them to move. She became a sovereign in form, a safeguard in function, and eventually, a shadow in memory. Her story remains difficult to define, not because it lacks substance, but because the system she served was built to leave her unremembered. What do you think? Was she a savior or a shadow ruler?